Thank you. Good afternoon. As we get started, I'll ask that everybody please silence your cell phones and any other mobile device that you might have brought along today. But if you would like to tweet about the great thoughts and ideas I know that you're going to hear, please do so. Our Twitter address is @ADVIS Schools with one S in the middle, so technically it's ADVIS Schools, or you can use the hashtag ADVIS Schools. I'm Barb Kraus-Blackney, Executive Director of ADVIS, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to our annual Trustee Conference, especially this year with our focus on zero-based strategic thinking and today's extraordinary speakers. I want to personally thank each of you for carving out time from what I know are very busy schedules for training in your critical roles as trustees of your school. And I really want to give a shout out to 5 schools in particular for doing a yeoman's job and getting just a critical mass of your entire board of trustees here today for today's program, because that really is a great way to start effecting change. We have, and these counts may be slightly off because the count kept morphing even through today, but I think we have 16 folks here from Lancaster Country Day School. 12 from the Shipley School, 11 from Upland Country Day School, 9 from Montgomery School, and 9 from Gladwin Montessori School. So you're the stars for today. Thank you. We are indebted to the Shipley School for hosting us today. And as some of you may have noticed, there's a little construction project going on, so it really may not have been the very most convenient time for the school to host a major outside event. But Steve Pilch, head of school here, never says no to ADVIS when we ask if we can host a program here. And the school always does, and the many folks here who work behind the scenes to help us coordinate all the logistics always just do a super job. And for that, ADVIS is extremely grateful. Will you please join me in giving Shipley a hand? Thank you. So for those of you not very familiar with ADVIS, I'd just like to briefly tell you a little bit about us. We're a network of 130 member independent private schools from throughout the 13-county greater Delaware Valley region and beyond. We advocate for and educate the general public about independent private education and our member schools, and we provide first-rate professional development and networking opportunities for the leadership of our schools. You may not know it, but this region has the densest concentration of independent schools in the nation. Our member schools hail from 4 states, but the vast majority fall within a 30-mile radius of Philadelphia. Collectively, our members educate nearly 50,000 students, employ over 11 in need-based financial aid to 35% of the students in our schools, and have an annual operating budget greater than $1 billion. Our schools have a broad range of missions, but this is what you all have in common. You are nonprofit, you are independently financed, and you are governed by boards of trustees responsible for the school. And you are committed to educational excellence in serving the students that you have the freedom to determine are the best fit for your mission. So again, welcome and thank you for your presence and attending to your professional development in your extremely important role as a trustee of your school. And like our member schools, ADVIS relies on a dedicated and visionary board of trustees, many of whom, past and present, are here today. So thank you all for all of your service and support of ADVIS. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our board president, Chris Tompkins, head of school of the Perkiomen School, which is a middle, secondary, and post-grad day and boarding school in Pennsburg, PA. Chris, thank you.
Well, I want to extend my welcome to all of you as well, and I also want to make sure that I specifically call out Barbara and the entire staff at ADVIS, because without them, we wouldn't have programs such as this. And you can see by being here tonight, it takes quite a bit of effort and coordination to get these right. And so, Barb, thank you, and thank you to the staff. Because of the importance of best practice by our boards of trustees, I don't want to mess with this computer, so I'm going to move this over here, forgive me. And school committees for our friend schools, ADVIS has set our governance track of programs as a strategic priority, holding 5 programs each year, with this annual trustee conference our long-standing keystone program. To keep these events accessible to our members in terms of cost, we rely on both the generosity of our host schools as well as our corporate partners. As ADVIS board president, I want to take a moment to thank and recognize that ADVIS receives support from close to 70 corporate supporters whose contributions support our membership and program fees. Several of these businesses are represented by some of you in attendance here tonight. I'd like to acknowledge 6 companies in particular for making specific contributions to underwrite today's event. ADVIS preferred partner, EduTech Academic Solutions, for underwriting our entire governance track of programs this year, as well as our technology programs. Best Schools Consulting Group, Connect One Bank, Glenn Mead, Visual Sound, and Wilson Construction. We're especially grateful to these 6 firms for their support this afternoon, and of course, all of our corporate underwriters. So I'd like you to ask me and join me in thanking them all this evening. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce the next ADVIS president for the term coming up in 2015 to 2017, Steve Lisk, who is head of school at Lancaster Country Day. And I'd like him to come up so he can introduce our speakers this evening. Steve.
Good afternoon. It's nice to see such a full assembly here. Between now and the dinner hour, we'll enjoy 2 TED-like talks. That is, both speakers will present for about 20 to 30 minutes. First, Grant Lichtman, Senior Fellow at the Martin Institute for Teaching Excellence, followed by John Fry, President of Drexel University. At the conclusion of both of their presentations, they will engage together in the conversation before us, and we'll have the chance to ask them some questions directly from the floor. Grant Lichtman, Senior Fellow at the Martin Institute for Teaching Excellence, also a consultant to the National Business Officers Association, an expert on innovation in schools, and he is nationally recognized as a thought leader in the drive to transform our schools K-12. For almost 15 years, Grant served as a trustee, also as a chief officer of finance and operations, and also a teacher at the Francis Parker School in San Diego, one of the largest independent schools in the United States. Over a decade and a half of remarkable transformation at this school, Grant was intimately involved in strategic planning, program design, campus planning and redevelopment, global education, advancement marketing, educational technology, admissions and financial aid, benchmarking and trend analysis, and risk management. He also writes. He's the author of Ed Journey, A Roadmap to the Future of Education, which was just published this fall. His previous book, The Falconer, What We Wished We Had Learned in School, is based on his seminar in strategic and design thinking. And he most recently has had a thought-provoking article this past spring in Independent School magazine entitled Mutations in Global Consumerism, the Impacts on K-12 Education and the Independent School Response. Before working in education, Grant directed business ventures in the oil and gas industries in the former Soviet Union, in South America, and the U.S. Gulf Coast. He graduated from Stanford University with a BS and MS in geology in 1980, studying deep ocean basins in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, as well as the Bering Sea. Grant, welcome. I'm going to take the opportunity to interview our second speaker as well, so we'll have a smooth transition between the two of them. John Fry has been an innovator in every sense at not just one, but 3 of our area local universities with significant national profiles. John was appointed Drexel University's 14th president in 2010 and has served higher education for his entire professional life. He is one of the chief architects of the revitalization of West Philadelphia, begun during his tenure at the University of Pennsylvania from 1995 to 2002, and continue today in Drexel's current initiative to create Innovation Neighborhood. Through his roles as a consultant, administrator, chief operating officer, and chief executive, he's acquired a deep and broad understanding of the challenge of leading major educational institutions. Prior to Drexel, John served as president of Franklin and Marshall College from 2002 to 2010 and was a driving force in the college's growth, the development of its campus, and its improved financial standing. He raised the college's national profile and brought renewed confidence to that institution. Moreover, he aligned with leadership in the city of Lancaster to create an improvement district that has made a deep and visible difference in the life of the city. Previously, John was executive vice president of the University of Pennsylvania, that school's top non-academic position. He was a major force in developing and implementing Penn's Agenda for Excellence, a comprehensive plan that guided strategic initiatives from 1996 to 2001. And before joining Penn, he was a consultant to higher education, and in that capacity worked closely with some of the nation's premier colleges and universities. John has served on the boards of 3 ADVIS schools, at least 3 that I'm aware of. John, if I miscounted, you need to correct me, including my own Lancaster Country Day School, where I had the joy of working with John as our board president. He continues to serve on one of our boards and is a current parent in one of our schools. And I'll put it this way, I don't think he needed GPS to find his way today here to Shipley. A native of Brooklyn, New York, John studied American civilization at Lafayette College and earned a master's degree in business administration from New York University's Stern School of Business. He will share from his experience in zero-based strategic thinking, in reimagining the role of education at Drexel and in higher education. Please help me in welcoming both Grant and John to our event. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and I'm really so honored to be here to get to share the stage with John Fry. As the introduction was going there, I was thinking on the airplane here, I was listening to some tracks of the Grateful Dead opening for Bob Dylan, and there may be some similarity there, being a California boy. I know which role I'm in. So you heard a little bit about my background. I want to make the point I'm a school guy. After a career in the for-profit world, I spent a decade and a half at a large independent school and wore a lot of those hats. Here's where I want to start my story. I think 6 or 7 years ago, many of us recognized that the conversation had substantially changed in education. Some of the things that we've been talking about for some for years and some for decades, the recognition that the world is changing at really a remarkable pace, unprecedented in human history, finally sort of penetrated and percolated into education world. And perhaps there's no more clear indication of that or more clear road marker of that than the fact that really probably for millennia, if not the principal job of education, at the core of education has been the transfer of knowledge from a teacher to a student. And now our students, all of us, can acquire so much of that knowledge right here. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is the business? What is the relevance of formal education going forward? I've been looking forward to the start of that conversation for several decades. I've been thinking and talking and preaching and writing about what we now call 21st century skills, but a lot of that quite a bit more. So a couple years ago, as this conversation was becoming more robust, and really in a very short period of time, on a plane ride home one evening from Chicago to San Diego, I decided to quit my day job. And let's see if this is working. Put it into play mode, or no? That's not what that's supposed to be. Time out. Yep, okay. So actually, before asking my wife if this was okay, I asked her subsequently for the patience. I decided to leave that well-paying job at Francis Parker School, pack up my Prius, and I drove around the country for 89 days, 10,000 miles, I got 48.3 miles per gallon on the total trip in the car. I visited 64 schools, public schools, private schools, K-8s, K-12s, a couple of charter schools. And I really had three questions that I was asking. I wanted to know what innovation meant to these schools. I hadn't selected the schools necessarily because they were known to be necessarily innovative. I wanted to ask them, what are you doing differently today than you were 5 or 10 years ago? And how are you preparing, or how are you hoping to prepare our students for a future that's different than the future looked like when we were in school? I wanted to ask them, what are the obstacles that you've had to overcome to start making that transition? What hasn't been working? And then, of course, share those successes of what has been working. I started blogging when I was on the road and getting some followers, and I pretty quickly realized there's probably a book in this. What I'm not going to do tonight and try to do in 25 minutes is tell you everything that's in that book. That sounds incredibly self-serving, and it is. I think I get about 50 cents a copy by the book. But this is really the story. The book is the story of the 600 or 700 educators, teachers, administrators, and parents and students who I was privileged to visit with and interview during that trip and synthesize what they were telling me in terms of how they view the future of education, both the trials of getting there and the successes. But here are kind of a few big key takeaways. The first is that I found an amazing congruity to the answer to the question, what is it we actually want? What are the skills that we want for our students to have when they leave high school? We've had this discussion for quite a while, and we often end up with a list that looks something like this, and some people try to get all the words there to start with C or P, or to spell a certain word down the left-hand side or something like that. And some people refer to these as 21st century skills. I think a lot of us believe there's nothing 21st century whatsoever about the need for these skills. These are timeless skills. I call them nth century skills. The reason I use this particular list, I think this conversation is over. I think at an 80% level, almost everybody I've talked to, whether we have a student in school or whether we're in a school ourselves, agrees with something like this. The reason I like this particular list is that while some schools and some institutions, some groups struggle for a long time to come up with this list, this was generated 3 groups of high school students. I gave them each 3 minutes and I said, what are the skills you need to be successful in your lives? So that represents a total of 9 minutes of thinking of about 25 high school students. And as far as I'm concerned, it's as good as any list I've ever seen. I found that there are substantive differences in what schools are doing. And when I was able to come back and synthesize all of it, the synthesis, what I call them the buckets, I came up with words like this, that schools are becoming more permeable and more adaptive and more creative. And these are sort of chapter heading sorts of things. I'm not going to go into all the stories. But what the key takeaway was that these words, when we look at what these schools were telling me, is that the sorts of things that we should be doing to prepare our students for this more uncertain, less noble future, these are the words that describe natural ecosystems, much more than they describe the industrial age, assembly type of educational system that we have in the past. Words like predictable and scalable and repeatable. And so I go a great deal in the book, and the real differences, the foundational differences between how an engineered system is designed and how natural ecosystems evolve and succeed. I think I found and saw on so many points that we've become embedded. There's a disconnect between teaching content and context, between students learning the knowledge that's going to that they're going to allow them to do well on an examination, and those skills that they articulated that they needed. We've known, at least since the age of Dewey and Montessori and the giants of the progressive era, and maybe as far back as Socrates, that it is a false choice. Our students, if we provide our students experiences through which they become deeply engaged and passionate about their learning, they're going to learn that content better than if we just tell them this is something you really have to know, and that's the argument for it. In terms of the obstacles, in terms of getting over this bridge and changing the way that schools look and the way learning takes place, there are these 3 big buckets of obstacles that repeated to me time and time again. The first one I called anchors. And it's primarily the relationship that we, the adults, have with the learning process. The 3 anchors that were mentioned to me most often were really this attraction that we the adult have. This is my subject, my time, and my space. It's my classroom, and in my classroom, I teach this subject for this time during the day. And where educators were able to start letting go of those anchors or intentionally cutting those anchors, that egotistical connection that this is my job to provide this to the students. It's amazing how quickly even veteran educators they told me, they said, you know, the weight of the world I felt was off my shoulders. I'm allowing the students now to take over much more of that role. In terms of external obstacles, and I mentioned this, and I hope that we can get a discussion when Dr. Fry talks. By far the most mentioned obstacle outside the school system was the college admissions process and the college board examination process, where we'd go to schools, and the elementary schools and maybe even the middle schools, you'd see these incredibly sort of creative, dynamic places in the classroom where students were allowed to pursue their passions and be creative and work together and collaborate. And then they'd get into ninth grade at those same schools. A lot of that would really just flatline as folks focused on the college admissions process, a lot of which I think is probably not true, but there's certainly the perception is very strong and is out there. And third, and I see this more and more, and I was telling this to the people the other day when I was in Chicago, was that just yesterday? Day before? Yesterday. These silos that we have constructed our schools around, the silos of classroom, department, subject, division, office, teacher, administrator, trustee. These silos are pervasive and rigid. And more as I work with schools around the country, it seems like I can tell people, I said, if you want to find the root of the obstacle to moving, to changing your school, find the silos and breach them. And so one of the things I hope we'll do after dinner is give you a little taste of that. As I've worked with schools around the country and they say, Grant, can you come and work with our faculty for the day? I say, yes, and please. Invite in a few trustees and a few students and a few other parents, and let's work this problem together and breach these silos that have been so pervasive at schools in the past. I think there are three things that schools that are making this transformation do very well. I think that first of all, they have a powerful forward-leaning vision that understands the changing relationship between students, teachers, and knowledge, and that forward-leaning vision is shared and can be clearly articulated by many people, many stakeholders in the school. Secondly, they very intentionally and transparently are aligning their resources in support of that vision. I visited so many schools, they said, you know, this is where we want to get to, this is this pilot project, it's a great thing and we're supporting it. We check off that box, but you know what? These people at that end of the hall had no idea what those people at that end of the hall were doing. And I had this idea of brush fires or campfires, and these brush fires are burning, but there's no conflagration, there's no connectivity amongst those because the resources of the school, time, space, money, and people were not aligned in any intentional way in support of that collaborative vision. And third, the schools are very good at effectively communicating the differentiated value that they offer that some other schools don't. I'll mention the remarkable competition out there now that didn't exist 20 years ago, opportunities for families to choose where their students might go to school. After the trip was over, I was able to collaborate with some folks, one of whom, Shoshana Zuboff, one of the first tenured women at the Harvard Business School. I was able to meet with her in her home for 5 hours in Maine. She's an historical economist. Shoshana talks about how we have gone past the tipping point of a global change in the relationship between consumers and producers. She uses the example, as many others have, of what happened in the music industry when the Sony Records used to say to us as consumers, here's a CD with 12 songs on it, you're going to buy it. And now we expect a tailored opportunity to select songs off of iTunes, buy them one at a time, and in something like 3 years, music industry revenues drop by 80%. It's this change in relationship between large institutions and companies that say, this is what I have to sell, you're going to buy it, to one now globally and across sectors, we as consumers say we expect a tailored product to us that you're going to sell to us. And so we go on eBay or Amazon and buy things rather than going to Penny or to Sears. We have our E-Trade account rather than buying stocks from Solomon Brothers or Merrill Lynch, and on and on. And certainly this applies to education. In my home area in San Diego Unified, which represents about 400,000 or 500,000 students, this year, 50% of the students in that geographic area will not go to their neighborhood school. There's a remarkable number relative to 10 or 15 years ago. Choice school, magnet school, charter school, hybrid learning, online learning, private school programs, whatever it is, but 50% of kids are making a choice other than their neighborhood school, and those opportunities just didn't exist like they did maybe a decade ago. Marina Gorbis is the director of the Institute for the Future, a think tank in Silicon Valley, and she talks about how so much of the relationships we have now are based on mutual interest, not based on commercial transactions. She calls it social. So you can go, two programmers, two people who are interested in programming something can go online and program in open source code, make that software available with no expectation of receiving a commercial reward for it. If I'm starting a new company, I go on Kickstarter and people fund it without an expectation of return. If you want to go direct the telescope at the Harvard Astronomical Observatory, you can go on and ask that to be done, and this multi-million-dollar telescope will point somewhere because you ask it to. And this is the environment, the ecosystem that our students, our children are growing up in, which allows all of us to bypass some of the major industries and operations that were the purveyors, were the sellers of so much of this in the past. And finally, Logan LaPlante. I don't know if any of you have seen Logan LaPlante's YouTube video of his TEDx talk, which has about 6.5 million more views than my TEDx talk has. Logan LaPlante was then a 13-year-old student in Truckee, Nevada, on the border of California and Nevada. Has anybody seen his TEDx? A few of you have. Where he and his family, he says, I'm hack schooling my own education. I take a class online. My parents bring in an expert with a group of parents in the community. I have an internship over at this school. I go play on this sport team. I'm putting this all together. This is the kid. We would all love to have him at our school, a marvelous, but he's hacking his own way through his education, doing it at a low price point and absolutely tailoring it to his needs, the needs of he and his family. So why do I mention all this? I think we are in the beginning but incredibly rapid evolutionary phase of a global neural network that allows for the creation, management, exchange, and sharing of knowledge. For all of those of you who grew up learning Latin and things, I apologize for it. I know the Latin is sketchy. I call it the cognitosphere, just the fifth global sphere in 4.5 billion years of evolution on this planet. We have the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, and the biosphere. And now for the first time, because of global connectivity, the fact that 4.5 billion people in the world have one of these or something close to it and are able to connect, create, and share knowledge, we've entered this neural network. And what does it mean? What does it mean to have big nodes where these strands come together and others that are off in some distal area? I think what it means is, and I think this actually, when people say, Grant, what is education going to look like in the future? This is the best representation I can come up with. And I think whether you're an individual, a student, an organization, a university, a laboratory, a library, if you are one of those big nodes where the strands come together, you're powerful and relevant. And if you're not powerful and relevant. And I think it correlates well with, for example, the development of the Western continental United States in the 19th century. Where if a town was in a location where the railroad and the telegraph lines came through, it's still an important city today. And if not, a lot of them blew away in stiff winds a long time ago. I don't think that schools are going to be powerful and relevant 20 years from now based on where their kids went to college 20 years ago, the size of their endowment, or the name of the school. I think they're going to be powerful and relevant based on the degree to which they have a footprint in the world where they and their individuals are connected, they're creating knowledge, they're sharing that knowledge, and they're an important part of the cognitosphere. Which brings me to a story called The Hollywood Blacklist. There's a wonderful book by a woman named Sarah Lewis called The Rise. Anybody read The Rise? It's a wonderful book. There's a chapter in the book, I read it 6 months ago or so. There's a chapter in the book that tells about a gentleman named Franklin Leonard, who is in Hollywood and is one of the guys that you send your screenplay to if you want to have it turned into a movie. And his job is to filter it out and pass some of them up to the producers and say we ought to consider the script or not. Statistically in Hollywood, the chance of a script that gets turned into any one of these movie houses actually being turned into a movie is 0.3%. Remember that for a second, 0.3%. About 7 or 8 years ago, this gentleman anonymously sends out an email to 70 other production houses with one question on it and asks for a response. It says, I want to know the name of a script that you have that you absolutely love. You think it would make a great movie. You think it would make a fabulous movie, and you're not producing it. And they did. People sent this back. They didn't know who they were sending it to, but they did. The first Hollywood blacklist came out. Here are some of the movies that were on that list. King's Speech, 11 Academy Awards, Juno, Charlie Wilson's War of the Kite Runner, there were others. For the last 7 or 8 years, now people know who this gentleman is, and he keeps sending this out. It's become one of the richest areas to mine ideas for new movies in Hollywood. The chances of a script being taken off of the Hollywood blacklist now and turned into a movie in Hollywood now is 40%. 40% versus 0.3. So of course the question is why aren't these movie houses producing these scripts that they love, things that they really want to do? And the answer was very clear and widely expressed. We don't want to make a movie for which we don't have an analog of past success. If we can't look at that script and say, yeah, that's a whole lot like this other one that succeeded, we're not going to produce it, even though we think it's a wonderful thing to do. Well, the dynamite started going off in my head. The bell started going off in my head. The second thing that Sarah Lewis mentions is that we know, going back to psychological studies back to the 1950s, that anytime we're in a group, within a group of people, where we are expressing our interests or our opinions visibly, after the first person raises their hand and says, this is what I think, statistically, the odds of somebody else disagreeing with them go down. We know it. It's black letter law in psychology studies. So the bell started going off more loudly in my head. The reason that these people expressed these movies ideas was because it was anonymous. Before I actually got done with my trip, and subsequently for about 15 months, I was in groups like we're going to have after dinner, where we had a lot of Post-it notes and flip chart paper to play with. And I asked people the same question. I asked them to do the same activity. Please write down on a Post-it note a question that starts with the words, what if, that would fundamentally change something at your school in a direction you'd like it to go. That was about it. Virtually no direction, but it had a question that start with the words, what if. Rather than leaving all that data behind, after each one of these sessions, I collected all those, and on the plane home, I'd be typing them into a database. And at the end of about 15 months, I'd had this question asked by about 1,700 educators, and there's the distribution. Faculty and academic administrators, business officers, administrators, heads, trustees, etc. I ended up with about 2,000 of these what-if questions from a very random sample of folks, mostly independent schools, by the way. And I synthesized them. I started putting them into buckets. I said, okay, which ones correlate? It's a very subjective exercise, but somebody has to do it. I threw out about 250 or 300 of them because they were really higher order questions like, what if we fired Miss Brown? Or what if the head of school wasn't such a jerk, or something like that? They didn't really seem to correlate with much of anything. I threw those out, but the rest of them correlated into about 40 different buckets or categories. Don't try and squint at this. You're not going to be able to. By the way, this is being published in Independent School Magazine, I think in February. It'll come out. I'm kind of previewing it. I put this slide up to show 70% of all the responses fell into just 10 categories, which is remarkable. There's 10 categories. What do you want in your school? Here's what those top 10 are. We want to break the silos of subject and discipline. Why do we have departments? We know that's not how the world works. We want to teach big, broad themes and across subject disciplines. We want to have more time to collaborate together and work with our colleagues, not based in these silos. We want the students to take much more ownership of the learning themselves, not be the ones preaching this knowledge, but the students helping to develop the curriculum, even negotiate what type of classes we're going to be teaching with their teachers based on mutual passions and interests. And on down with student assessment, the grade book, the daily schedule, where by far the most two common words on the Post-it notes for the daily schedule were blow up. Nobody said, let's slightly tweak the daily schedule and add a few more minutes here and there. Everybody said, let's blow it up. all the way down to the bottom there where you can see, again, get rid of the APs was a common one. So what went off in my head with this, and why do I relate it back to the blacklist? I've looked at a lot of strategic plans from independent schools, and I can, at an, I don't know, 70 or 80% level, run through the general topics that are in strategic plans. We're going to hire and retain great faculty. We're going to be financially sustainable. We're going to increase diversity, have good technology, raise a lot of money. Well, right at, not 100% level, but I'm close for most of the strategic plans. None of them, virtually none of them, have anything that speaks to this, which are the elements that the vast majority of people, given the ability, given the opportunity to anonymously say what they want, expresses what they want for our schools. And there's a big disjunct there. So I think our thinking is out of date. Our strategic thinking is out of deference to those who've led strategic thinking in schools for many years. It's not that what they've done in the past is wrong, it's that the world has changed. We do strategic planning on infrequent basis, 5-year cycles. The world is completely different than it was in education over a 5-year period. Much of what we look at is inside the frame. We ask questions that start with how and what. How can we do better what we were doing last year, rather than asking questions like what if and how might we, that expand the frame, blow up the frame, and think about things in a very, very different way. Because of this effect of getting a bunch of people in a room, getting focus groups together and publicly saying this is what I think, and people tending to not want to disagree with it, we end up with a homogenized set of documents that tend to look like everybody else's. And the process results in something, frankly, that I think is largely looking inward and behind us. And so I was in a session with a bunch of business officers from the New York Association. We were talking about this, and someone said, Grant, what you're describing is the same thing as zero-based budgeting. Let's call it zero-based strategic thinking. So I stole it from them. I stole that phrase from them. And here's what I think zero-based strategic thinking is. And I'm working with schools doing this now. It's ongoing. We don't do it every 5 years. We work the problem. We tweak things. We evolve. It's not big quantum iterations. It's a constant evolutionary process. We ask questions that expand the frame of our thinking, not are contained within the frame of thinking. And it's very important. Questions matter. The nature of questions matter, and the type of question you ask. We get outside ourselves. We look for analogs and models that are outside of our own school, and in fact, outside of education completely, for what's working in other knowledge-based industries around the world. And we make sure that we're actually aligning our resources to that vision. We don't just check off the box. When we look at how people are being used, how money is being used, how space is being used, I can't tell you how much the use of space informs the learning process as much as anything I see in the many, many schools that I visit. And so rather than organizing this thinking process, the strategic thinking process around silos, I've asked people to build window teams. Windows as opposed to silos, breach these silos. And in a couple of schools I'm working with, here are the nature of the window teams. Teams that are formed of faculty, staff, trustees, even a student, where their responsibility is to look at these key issues of learning. This is what we do. The core of what we do is learning. It's not raising money and financial sustainability and hiring. The core of what we do is learning. And so the window team's responsibility is to pursue the vision of the school through these lenses that are key to learning. This is just an example at one school of the teams that we've put together, and those now become the locus of ongoing strategic thinking. Does it mean the trustees don't have anything to do? Of course not. There's plenty for the trustees to do, but in terms of the real elements of learning and transformative learning, these become the loci of that thinking. So let me tell you one more story, and then I'm going to get off here and let the main act come on. In September, I was at 2 different schools. Well, I was a lot of different schools, but 2 different schools I want to highlight. One, but they're both public schools, by the way. One, Ortiz Middle School in Santa Fe, New Mexico, an enormously underserved community, a D-performing school in New Mexico, where the unofficial motto of the ninth. And this is a D-ranked school in New Mexico. 99% Latino students, probably 50% illegals, a really underperforming school. The principal is a fellow who grew up there, went to West Point, came back, and is a great educator and said, we can turn this around. He brought a couple of us in. We are going to turn this school around through some incredible effort on the part of the faculty and staff, and it's going to become a great school within a few years. We talked to the principal and debriefed with him about where does he want to get to and what are his obstacles to get there. 2 weeks later, I'm at Palo Alto High School, right across the street from Stanford, arguably the closest thing you can get to a private school in America. It's not a private school. All the resources in the world. They want to build a new gym. Somebody gave them $30 million. I mean, somebody from Apple or somebody, here's $30 million, build a new gym. Talk to the principal. Where do you want to be as an educator? What type of education you want to provide? What does innovation mean to you? What are the obstacles? And at the end of that conversation, I said, you know what? 90% of what we just talked about, I had that same conversation with this gentleman at a school that could not be farther away from you in every respect. And yet the issues are exactly the same. I said, here's my takeaway from that. No one would argue that Palo Alto High School is not a great school. But I'm going to argue that it's not a leading school. You're not leading in anything. I said, can I write that? She said, in a blog. She said, please do. My superintendent needs to hear that. I think Ortiz Middle School is down here somewhere. They're a poor school. They may not even be on this chart. They're down here. But I think they're a leading school. And so I asked, what do you want to be? Where do you want to be here? What does great and leading mean? It's actually something I'm going to ask you to consider this evening. So with that, those are some things that happened in and since my trip. I'm going to shut up and I'm going to look forward to our conversation and then our work after dinner where we can be more interactive rather than having one person preaching at a whole bunch of other people. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to John.
That was a great talk, Grant. Thank you. And it gives us a great framework for the conversation that we'll have later on. I want to start by thanking Barb and Chris and Steve and the ADVIS board and the staff at ADVIS for the great work that they do for independent schools. So my wife, Kara, and I are true believers in independent schools. Our oldest, Mia, is a product of Baldwin Lower School, Lancaster Country Day School in the middle school, and St. Andrews School in upper school. She got to see great leaders like Blair Stambaugh, Mike Mursky, and Tad Roach in action, and continues to confer with Tad to this day. Nat, our 19-year-old, is a product of Lancaster Country Day School and the Shipley School, had a great education here. Steve List, Steve Pilch were great role models of his. And our little Phoebe started at LCDS. She's in 8th grade here at Shipley, and so she gets all the benefits of what her big brother got. We're very privileged as a family to be able to serve the schools that our children went to. We were involved at Lancaster Country Day School. We were involved at the Shipley School. We volunteered at St. Andrews. I also had the opportunity to work with Joe Cox from the Haverford School. I served on his board for many years. And in a way, it was the smallest way of paying back the huge gift of independent school education that our children were given. And so all of you here as trustees and as heads of school, you do amazing work and you impact families like mine in really profound ways. I'm so grateful to all of you for doing that. I want to thank Steve Pilch and his great team for hosting this event. I want to give a shout out to my friend Wendy Hill. Where are you, Wendy? I saw you before. There she is. Wendy Hill was the phenomenal provost of Lafayette College. I had the privilege of watching her in action, leading our educational policy committee at the college. And Agnes Irwin is so lucky to have you. Let's say a nice welcome to Wendy. I also want to congratulate Bob Shields for winning the Visionary Service Award. People like Bob are the backbone of these schools. Let's give him a hand as well. So they told me Grant would be a hard act to follow, and they were absolutely right. And so that is the main act. I will do my best to follow in his considerable footsteps. But I think the main point he made, among other things, is that there is a seismic shift for independent schools. There's a seismic shift for education in general. And real governance and real leadership is about stepping up to those challenges. And believe me, it extends well beyond the K through 12 space. So I'll start by saying something obvious. I profoundly believe that our private colleges and universities are one of America's greatest treasures, and our institutions have done so much for so many. It's also been one of the most durable and resilient and innovative sectors in American society. So much of American society is built on the knowledge and the research and the impact that our colleges and universities have had. But even so, in many ways, this is a sector, higher education, that's under siege at this point. High cost, an inefficient model, heavily siloed, lots of deep verticals of knowledge, not enough horizontal collaboration, very input focused, not as much outcomes oriented, very opaque to people from the outside, not at all transparent, and honestly, to many, islands of privilege, not accessible to many, but at the very, very top of the socioeconomic ladder, or if they have a strong commitment to financial aid, at the bottom of that ladder. And so it's something that that is becoming scarce for many. And again, I'm talking about private colleges and universities. So based on what I know as a trustee of a number of these institutions, and from what I see and hear, many people see independent schools in the same light as private higher education. That is not a good thing for us. And you can take this if you want. I take it as a critique and I take it as a challenge that we need to meet head on and not treat as just a bunch of bad public relations, because too often, we think about cranking up the PR machine. If we can do better marketing, explain the return on investment, it also requires serious action if we're going to continue to be competitive. So I believe that both private higher education and independent schools are sectors that will be prone to real disruption in the future. And so I want to frame my remarks around a couple of principles regarding disruption. I do not stand in front of you here to give you any advice. You have complicated institutions. I know you're doing very well with those. I don't pretend to be an advice giver. I just want to give you observations about how I think about my institution, the boards I serve on, the work that I try to do. So first, disruptive environments sometimes, probably not often enough, lead organizations like ours to do their own disruptive thinking about how our institutions must change. But disruptive thinking, I would tell you, is probably best first done in an environment where there is a stable base, there are strong fundamentals, and the work about thinking about the future is a shared endeavor among the institution's many constituencies. In other words, if you don't have it together, it's probably not a good idea to do a lot of disruptive thinking, because the base underneath you will shift, and then you will be out on the edge. And when you're out on the edge, that's not a good place. The second thing about disruptive thinking is that if you're going to do it, it needs to be really, really focused. If you're going to make changes that are disruptive, keep them to one or at the most two, and make sure that these changes help create a more distinctive, a more powerful mission, and an identity for your institution, because there's only so much change that these institutions can handle. And when we're talking about disruptive change, big moves, big strategic investments, we're talking about a lot for an institution to handle. And I think it needs to be done, particularly if you're in a competitive environment. That's very difficult. On the other hand, it's fraught with some risk. And so to do more than what I say, I believe, would be to take on enormous risk. However, the only thing riskier than that is to actually hunker down and hope that this disruptive environment will pass too. And I can tell you that it's not going to pass. We are in for a whole bunch of really challenging decades ahead. I think we are seeing that in many institutions in profound ways already, and I think it's going to, in some ways that are really bad, and in some ways that may have a silver lining, really sort of shake our sectors to the core. Let me then go back to the basics before you get to the disruptive, thinking. What are the basics and the fundamentals? And again, there's nothing new that I will tell you, but I can tell you that these are the things that I obsess on all the time. And I think your point about strategic planning on a 5-year basis is absolutely right. And anyone who's thinking, let's sit down every 5 years and have a good conversation about this is really sort of, missing the dynamism of this environment, which we need to respond to. So when I think about basics, I think of 7 things. The first is moving beyond admissions to student lifecycle management. And by student lifecycle management, I mean end-to-end recruitment through alumni engagement. We can't afford to obsess about the front end of the pipeline and then hopefully everything's going to work out well later on. It actually has to be a very intentional, strategic way of thinking about recruiting the right fit students, how to finance their educations, how to do serious academic and co-curricular and personal advisement, how to get these students really enfranchised and really engaged in what they're doing, how to make sure their transition points and transition points are thought through and well articulated. And also, finally, how to make them think as alumni even before they leave. How are they going to give back? How are they going to pay it forward? And then there's a social debt, at the very least, to be paid, because many of these institutions are built on endowments that people like you provided. And so we need to get our students thinking about the obligation to the generations coming forward. So there are a ton of details associated with things like that. I've spent the better part of 2 years basically reorganizing my university so it conforms to this idea of student life cycle management. Drexel is the original siloed administrative unit and or administrative institution, and it is deeply disturbing to my students to try to make their way throughout the various silos of the institution. I have office hours every Friday, and for the first several years, horror story after horror story after horror story, to the point where I started to intervene, and I became the connector. I would literally bring people in and say, okay, we have student X here, and financial aid is not talking to the registrar's office and talking to the billing office. Let's sit down and fix this problem. I didn't do that because I'm a micromanager. I did it because I wanted my people to start thinking, we cannot do this to our students. They're paying a lot of money to come here. They have very, very busy schedules. And if they have a problem, they're entitled to a pretty seamless response to their problems. And so whether it's on the academic side, these silos exist, or on the administrative side, in this case, student life cycle management is the way I think we need to think about our students, whether they're 6 or 7 years old or they're 18 or 19 years old. The second thing is we are doubling down on STEM education plus the arts, which is STEAM. I don't think you can do enough in this area right now. I think that it is a hugely competitive field. I think it's also a field that provides so many opportunities for our students as they go beyond your schools and my school to their professional lives. And just being literate in the STEAM disciplines is so important right now in American society, given the tremendous advances in science and technology. And so, we really need to have a good arts education. And I think we need to do more in the sciences than we do right now. Again, I won't bore you with the details. At Drexel, we have something called the Excite Center, which I would invite you, if you're curious, to see. It's the Center for Creative and Expressive Technologies. It's a huge mashup between electrical engineering and music and gaming and informatics. And it is the total horizontal organization. People just show up and jump in, and it's leading to some really interesting research, some really interesting new course design, and it's intentionally built as a complete end around in terms of the typical silo structure. But it is our sort of STEAM incubator at our university. The third, and even at institutions like yours, I think you have to start thinking about experiential learning at really young ages. I come from two institutions, University of Pennsylvania and Franklin and Marshall, that were founded by Benjamin Franklin. And, Benjamin Franklin's, credo was, all that is useful and all that is ornamental, theory to practice. And, we practice it at Drexel in a very specific way. It's called cooperative education. I won't go into the details of what co-op is, but I can tell you that once they're exposed to a workplace for 6 months, come back into a classroom and they have a different set of questions than they had when they set out. And they're 19 years old the first time they do it. By the time they're 23 and they've spent 18 months in the field, in real jobs, and learning the joys and the sorrows of the world of work, they're profoundly different. And they would have gotten a good classroom experience. They would have gotten a good arts and sciences education, but they are hyped up because of this experience. And by the way, it keeps my faculty on their toes, because there can be no yellow notes in that environment. You just can't, give the same lecture that you gave over and over again, because if your students are coming in with fresh information from the real world, you're going to have to, up your game or get out of the game. And so I think experiential learning, no matter how you practice it, in an independent school setting or at a university setting, something that really helps students learn better, get experience, and also helps them become better students in the classroom. The fourth thing, robust collaborations to leverage the experience of your students. We can't do it all. I know my institution, which is a really big institution, can't do it all. We absolutely depend on partnerships and collaborations to do our work. And without that, my students' experience wouldn't be as rich. All of you have opportunities with local nonprofits or colleges and universities that are nearby, or homeless shelters, or the various ways in which our community takes care of others in our community, to figure out how do you insinuate yourself in that ecosystem and make sure that your institution is part of something larger called a community that gives your students the benefit of doing work in different settings. And again, you can do that at all ages, I believe. I hope most of you have some sort of articulation agreements or partnerships with your local colleges and universities. If you don't, you should get them. And those would be good things for our institutions as well. The next is something that you had talked about before, financial sustainability. We're again doing a massive overhaul of the way in which we allocate and raise our resources. And I won't go into the details of that. It's something called responsibility center management. It's based on a system that thrived at the University of Pennsylvania that gave financial ownership and responsibility to people well beyond the central administration or the 2 or 3 people who do it maybe at your school. Everyone becomes a financial steward at one point or another. People think about revenue generation as well as what they're going to spend. And it's a very, very important discipline that people begin to treat this as how they treat their own, budgets at home. Matched up with this new budget system is top flight advancement. And if there's one thing I know about fundraising, is that it's not transactional. You can't sit down with someone and who is not really initiated and enfranchised and talk about a gift. If you do, you'll probably get a gift, maybe, but it probably won't be as good a gift as you can get. And I can tell you the largest gifts that we've seen have been the result of deep and sustained conversations. I don't think in any of the big gifts I've raised, there's ever been the big ask or even the handing of someone a proposal. It's a conversation, it's a dialogue, there's shared ownership, there's shared creation. And then one day you realize, you know what, we're going to do this. We're absolutely going to do it. And now let's sort of work out the details of how we're going to do this. We just named our law school with a gift of $50 million. There was never a proposal for $50 million handed over to that individual. There was a long conversation about the future of our law school that led him to say, you know what, I want to see that future secured. And as a result, we worked out the details. And so that was a 3-year conversation that occurred. And it was great. And it's great to have a real shared endeavor when you do these types of things. The sixth thing is that place really counts. Where you do your work really counts. You want to have a memorable campus. It's a key competitive advantage. But I just want to sort of put in one cautionary note. I think all of us, as we think about campaigns and the way we present ourselves, need to put people and program in front of CapEx. There's too much in these campaigns of let's lead with the next building, the next wing, the next big thing. We have to be talking about access and affordability for our students. We need to be talking about excellent faculty who are supported professionally. Those are the priorities. That's what makes the magic that we do. And yes, you need a place, you need a neighborhood, you need a physical environment to do that in, but let's not get those orders reversed. This is not about brick and mortar. It's about people, and it's about programs. And one of my trustees is always reminding me about my allocation of resources between bricks and clicks, because he thinks that we don't spend enough on technology, and he's right. And we've done a lot of soul searching about that. And then lastly, again, nothing new for any of you, robust shared governance. I think one of the things that we need to do is begin to focus more attention as boards and as leaders of these institutions on the self-perpetuating groups, if you will, the boards that self-perpetuate, the faculties that essentially self-perpetuate, and make them stronger and more dynamic bodies than they are in many cases. Administrations in a lot of these institutions are very, very powerful, and they need to be strong and they need to be well led. But administrations come and go. These other bodies perpetuate, and they need to develop strong cultures and a strong sense of ownership as well. They need to be as enfranchised as those administrations are. So that's how I think about our base. And this work is never, ever done. It's constant, it's frustrating. We get it wrong, we pick ourselves up, we try to get it right the next time. But without this kind of base, I know my institution certainly can't do the things that it needs to do. That said, if you can begin to get the basics right, or at least most of them, it's then about, okay, what's disruptive here? What can we do that's different, that will help us maybe break out of the box or anticipate big changes ahead? So I have just a few thoughts. Everyone obsesses on the cost of these institutions, and they're right to obsess on that. We're very expensive institutions, even with financial aid. But one thing we don't obsess enough about is time. Why does it take 4 years to go to college? Did anyone think about why we have to do it 7 months a year? I mean, I know my students for Franklin and Marshall, they'd spend all summer up on the campus, sometimes doing really great, work in laboratories with their, faculty based on summer research grants. Other times just working in Lancaster because their community are themselves and they wanted to be with their community. Yes, they would like to be home for a couple of weeks and take a break and see their families, but then they found themselves back to Lancaster with increasing frequency over the year because that's their community. Why do we only make them a year? They want to be in school, I'd say, 11 months a year. Why do our institutions set ourselves up in this sort of K-12 framework, especially when some kids maybe are ready for some advanced work, online or otherwise? And so what's the sacred thing about the 4 years? It's an agrarian calendar that we're using to run our colleges and universities. And so I think we need to think about time to degree, how we spend our time, whether or not we need 4-month summer breaks or whatever they are, because I would submit many of our students are bored, and especially if they can't get meaningful work. And now I'm talking more about college students than high school or below. So the first thing I would think about is that's disruptive. Well, let's start thinking about time because we just can't afford to waste it anymore. The second is that hybrid learning and online learning do not consider these things exotic. They are not exotic. Our students see things, classroom, hybrid learning, online learning, it's all the same thing to them. They want to do it this way. Sometimes they want to do it that way. For your students, I would do as much of this as possible because when they get to places like mine, that's their life. You don't want to have them taking their first online course when they're a freshman. And this is the way this is going to happen. You can still do personalized work, but I think they have to get very, very familiar with the different types of modalities, and it makes it richer. And by the way, as you know, not every student is the same kind of learner. Some really prefer a chat room than a big lecture hall to ask their questions and things like that. So I think we have to think about their capabilities there. Third, we got to do a lot more with entrepreneurship for our students. I won't go through the details of what we're doing. We have a new School of Entrepreneurship, the Charles D. Close School. We have our Excite Center. We just recruited Dream Adventures to open up their national headquarters on our campus. I want my students to try at least once to start something up on their own and to see how hard it is and how frustrating it is and how joyful it is, because I think that's a life skill. I don't think entrepreneurship belongs in a business school for only the kids who want to, start their own, ventures up from a business standpoint. I think entrepreneurship is a life skill. If you take a look at, and you might know these data, I'm not, familiar with the details, but how many jobs our students will have post-graduation. For many of us, it was sort of a more living number, probably 2 and 3 times as much for these students going out right now. Along the way, they will be between jobs. They should probably have the skills about how to start their own thing up to keep them sustained, and maybe they will find their muse and go on and to build new companies and to create great things. But I think that's a foundational skill. The fourth is global education. Into the details, it's so obvious at this point that if you're not globalized, if you're not language rich, if you're not doing comparative work, you're cheating your students. And Drexel has for years on languages in particular really cheated our students. So I'm on a tear in terms of putting languages up on the investment board for us. Civic engagement, they need to be out. They need to see what's going on in American society. They need to be engaged, not just occasionally, but on a regular basis in a way that makes a difference for the people who live around us. Sixth, there's a concept that we're very familiar with at Drexel. It's called OPM, other people's money. And that's not philanthropy, by the way. That's every time we approach a project, is there another source of income other than our own capital that we can put to use? As we speak on my campus now, there's $300 million being invested by a company in Texas who are building my residences. I'm out of the residential game, even though I'm a residential university at this point with about 6,000 beds. The reason is, why do we have to do that? Why do I have to provide, the expertise to build residences when someone could do it far better than me, more expensively, and frankly, a lot better? from a quality standpoint. I want my students to have great places to live, safe and clean and accessible and fun and social. I just don't feel like it's our job to do that. It's our job to ensure it gets done. And same with a whole bunch of other things. So we should think more about, are there private sector alternatives to some of the things that we do right now? Do we really have to be doing all this? Because our core competency is education, it's research, and it's creating a learning environment. Last, down the road, I think everybody should be thinking about mergers and affiliations and joint ventures. I can tell you that our institution has been enriched beyond words by our merger with the Academy of Natural Sciences in 2011. The oldest natural history museum in the United States is now part of us. We've formed a brand new academic department around biodiversity, earth, and environmental sciences. We couldn't have done that on our own in 25 years, anywhere near the quality that we've been able to do it with our new partner and affiliate, the Academy of Natural Sciences. Many of you exist in environments where you may be looking around and saying, in a crowded market, maybe we should start to think about some collaborations and even go further. So let me end with that and just give you some final thoughts, and then we can turn to the conversation. The first is, remember, when confronted with crisis, and I hope you're not, but when confronted with crisis, seize the chance to take advantage of that crisis and do something good with it. The proudest days that I think we had at the University of Pennsylvania in the mid-90s was were among the most tragic in terms of what was happening on the campus, in terms of the huge violent crime that we were experiencing. And there were two choices in the end in that crisis. Number one, put up the fence around the campus. Number two, let's think about how do we revitalize this neighborhood and forget about the fences. Even more, create strong corridors, create a vibrant environment, get our faculty and staff living in the neighborhood, attract businesses, create street life, do something that is sort of counterintuitive in a crisis, which is to hunker down. And that's what we did. And for those of you who have been around West Philadelphia lately and were there 20 years ago, it's night and day. And that's because a group of people said, we are not going to succumb to crisis. We are going to take crisis and we're going to flip it around and we're going to make it something that we can really prosper from. The second is, I would ask all of you, what long-term thing are you doing right now that will be your gift to future generations of students at your school? Not in 5 years, like I'm thinking 25 years. What's the work 2 or 3 generations ahead? What seeds are you sowing? What strategies are you laying out so that 25 years from now, your boards, your successors, whoever they are, look back and say, those people had real long-term interests in what we were going to do. I can go into some details at Drexel. I believe the absolute best work our administration is doing won't be revealed for another couple of decades. But when it is revealed, people will look and say, that's terrific. And then hopefully that'll inspire them to do the same. And then last, just, the biggest job for us as leaders, we need to instill ownership. We need to instill enfranchisement. We need to empower people. We need to think about succession, not in a haphazard way, but in a regular, ongoing way. Who's going to come after us and our leaders, and how is this all going to work? So I think that the true legacy of powerful leadership is when you make yourselves expendable. When it's going so well, when you have everyone lined up to come from behind to take your places and to move it forward, then you've really done your job. The minute you're indispensable is the minute that you are truly successful, I would submit. The last thing I want to say is, in the midst of all this, let us remember that while our challenges are real and I think in many ways joyful, the Philadelphia School District is facing the most profound, set of challenges and crises. I'd ask all of you to think about, how do we lean in to what they're doing, at least one of their schools, and with the excess, with the riches that we have, what can we do to help those schools? That may seem like an odd way to end a talk like this, but the fact is that there are those out there who are really, really struggling, and they could really benefit from our expertise and our help and any excess resources that we have that we can give to them as we're renewing our places. Just keep those people in mind, because they're fighting a massive fight out there, and there are no bad guys as far as I'm concerned. There's just a bunch of people who need more support, and I hope we can all give them that support. So we'll end there. I guess, Grant, we'll pick up and have our conversation now.
So I'd love to get questions out of the audience. Get some questions, yeah. You heard the preaching. How about some interaction here? Questions, comments, provocations.
I have a question.
I'm going to ask you to use the microphone, please.
Thanks, Jen.
Yeah, hi, I'm Bill Reeks from the Swain School. And Mr. Fry, I have a question for you on a comment that you made about the need for entrepreneurship in our schools. And I'm wondering, is that based on observations or changes that you see in business in terms of what business is, what you can count on from business and business society today? Or is it based on other things that you recognize? Or has it always been a need, and more simply, we just haven't provided it in our schools?
You know, I think what I've seen is that it's Silicon Valley worship. It's a very trendy and sexy kind of thing. But the fact is, when you think about it, when you try to start something out on your own, a business or a not-for-profit or something like that, think about all the skills that requires. Think about how to develop an idea, how to sort of write it down and express it, how to sell it to people, how to marshal the resources, how to get out there and actually produce it or provide the services that you think about. That is to me, such a powerful set of experiences. And I don't believe in any of the stuff as a matter of, well, did you succeed or fail? I think the life experience that creates is amazing. And the reason I'm amped up on this is because I think that these students are going into really uncharted territories in terms of the world of work. And I actually think of this in some ways as like really good survival skills. I think about my son, and he's a product design major at Drexel. He's playing squash. He's having a great career. But I mean, if he wants to go out and actually pursue that, he also better know how to stand up a business and to run it, because he may be in situations where that's the most viable way for him to do the work that he wants to do. And so I don't. It's not Silicon Valley worship for me. It's saying, let's give all these kids the gift of the safety net and the opportunity to do something really neat. And at the very least, even if they fail, look how much they've learned. And if they succeed, great for them.
I know when I graduated 30 years ago or so from either secondary school, when I graduated from secondary school and from college, there was no entrepreneurship. It was just, you just something you didn't learn within an academic environment. And of course, I ended up leading my own company, and I sort of taught myself and, scrapped to find it. And so I find it very enlightening and interesting and I agree with you that we should see a lot more of it. So that's my comment.
So let me say, in the K-12 sector, I think the conversation and the use of the term entrepreneurial has shifted away from a sole focus on business to the sort of skills that John was just describing. And if you go back to that list of skills that those 12th graders all put up for me in net 3 minutes, those are the sorts of skills I recommend, whether it's related to starting a business or just encountering the obstacles of life and overcoming them successfully. It was what my first book was about 15 years ago. They're the same set of skills. And so I don't think it has the context of business. And we see schools, the one that comes from the Hawkins School in Cleveland has a fabulous new school of entrepreneurialism. The Cushing Academies has one. And yesterday, when I was in Chicago talking with some schools about coming up with some big, hairy ideas, one of the schools from Washington, D.C. said, let's start a center for social entrepreneurialism, which no profit motive. It's the exact same set of skills. These are the skills that young people will serve them well in their futures.
Thank you.
Grant, in the schools that you visited, and John, in your own personal experiences at F&M and Drexel and UPenn, what can you share with us as insights for us as leaders of change, given the fact that presumably the kind of change we want to initiate is not a lightning strike, that's a flash and momentary, but is really tectonic, and particularly given your observation, Grant, that there are serious anchors, some of which are kind of above water and some of which are way below water, conscious and unconscious. How do we lead our organizations through that change in a way that will make sure that it sticks?
Well, I'll say two things, and there's a whole bunch we could talk about there because so much focus is on that. And the first one is, John said it earlier, there's two reasons organizations change. One, because you have to, or two, because it's the right thing to do. And boy, would we rather be changing because it's the right thing to do than because we have to. And the risk of not changing in this is greater than the risk of changing. I think that when I was identifying the issue of leadership and leading change in schools, schools have had a very unique and unfortunate relationship with the concept of risk. As John said, you don't want to make lots of risks that you're betting the farm on. But we've had an unfortunate relationship with risk starting from the way our students, I still remember today getting an F on a math test in second grade. It scarred me, right? Our teachers, our students, our administrators have always had a greater downside of taking a risk, the upside of taking a risk. We have to change that. If we don't change that, we're not going to ever contemplate the sort of disruptions and innovations that are needed. And that starts with the Board of Trustees hiring chief executives who are willing to model risk for their employees. If the head of school, if the head of school doesn't model risk taking, the employees, the faculty aren't going to do it, and the kids aren't going to do it. And if we don't do those things, we don't take the risk of failing and teach what we get out of failure, as not with the intent of failing, but what that means to us, we will never be willing to make changes. And I think it's a fundamental issue. We are way too cautious. We don't develop risk profiles. We don't develop risk portfolios. We don't do that at a very conscious level, and so that we know how to do these in a staged and reasonable fashion.
I guess, Christian, the only thing I would add is that I think when confronted with a situation where change is required, I think the leader needs to declare herself or himself first and say, look, I have an opinion about this. First of all, I don't think this is something that we can push aside for another 5 years. Second, I got to tell you what my take on this is. It's not fully formed, but here it is. And then I think that person really needs to invite the community to respond. And I think there starts the dialogue to the point where along the way, usually reasonable people will say, you know what, we really do have to do something here. And then it's a matter of negotiation in terms of what you can get them to do. Maybe you can't get them to do 100% of what you want, but look, if you get 75%, that's a good first shot. You come around and you pick up 10 or 15% later on. I think it's either sort of, I'm going to impose something on you, or I'm just going to sort of avoid it because I'm trying to protect you. People want to know what their leaders think, and they also want the privilege of actually talking and expressing their views in a sort of safe kind of way.
Hi, Ned Sherrill, Church Farm School. I have something sort of a basic question on my mind. As a secondary school principal, head of school, we're all about college prep. That's what we're marketing. What does that mean with the vision that you've just put forward? And is it a good idea?
Yeah, so this is the elephant in the room, as I said, in so many schools, especially those that have high schools, mention this as the elephant in the room. And here's the disconnect. If you go back to what those 12th graders said they feel will make the skills they need to be successful in their lives, and I would imagine at an 80% level that most college educators and administrators feel the same thing. We go to parents and we ask them, if we ask parents, a group of parents very agnostically, what do you hope for your children? What are the hopes, dreams, and aspirations you have for your children? Getting into college is one of them. But then there's this whole other list of things that are not part of that traditional, what we have thought of as college preparatory mindset. So there's a disconnect. And that's the struggle that I think we're having. And I know that, I imagine, I'd love to hear what John says, I've heard a lot of college folks saying they're having the same struggle.
Yeah, many of us are caught up in a sort of a crazy arms race where the number one way of signaling victory is rejecting as many people as you can. It's pathetic. It is, and as a parent, especially, so I watch this whole thing, and I don't know, maybe I'm just lucky to be at a place like Drexel, but I feel very free of that. We do well. I'd like to be more competitive. I don't like our U.S. News and World Report ranking, but I'm not obsessing about that. What I'm obsessing is about giving the gift of formation to these kids who are incredible kids. I don't care if they're SATs or whatever they are. I could care less. I don't know, and I don't want to know. What I want to know is that when they come to us, we can do great things for them. And then maybe that means we'll never advance in the US News and World Report rankings like we should. But I'd rather have that approach than be hanging around the top of the US News and World Ranking Report and thinking about how many more kids I reject. And that creates such risk aversion in terms of the way you approach problems, because your job basically is don't blow it. Don't blow this thing that we have right now. And what's sad about that is that in many cases, those are the institutions that can actually do the most in terms of innovation, because they have amazing people, they have capacious resources, they have these great histories. But too often, they're stuck, they're frozen, and what they're hanging on to is their prestige. And so I think we have to be much more, open about these things. And, for places like Drexel, I think we're very relaxed about this. We're doing a lot of great work, and the chips will fall in terms of how people view us.
I'll let you know, because I'm sure it'll never get published. I've written an op-ed piece for the New York Times that I'm sure will be rejected along with 99.9% of the rest of them. Maybe I'll ask John to co-author it with me. The suggestion is that starting with the most selective colleges in the country, that they make a pledge to publish the minimum SAT and ACT scores that they would allow an applicant to have. And once that folder is through the admissions door based on that minimum score, that the scores play no further role in the admissions process. And I don't see the downside to colleges and universities who really know and understand that above a certain level, all these kids are great kids, they're all going to be successful, and why is this a big driver that then you all have to use as an advertising tool? I think it would be a first chip away at that dam.
Take one more question over here.
I got the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Didn't know that.
I get the last one.
You've got
I
it,
get the
John.
last one. I want to pick up, John, where you left off. Just very last postscript about public education. And I think it's a pretty potentially disruptive idea. But in this room, we have representation from independent schools. Take great pride in the fact that we have some things in common. We're not for profit. What's our list, Barbara? We're not for profit, but we pride ourselves on having very unique kinds of ways about going about it, and I think that's one of our strengths. But I'm sensing a need for a unifying purpose. And I personally am far less concerned with my kids about how successful they are than how significant they are. I want my kids to come through our institution as strong, ethical leaders that are prepared to make a change in the world. And so I don't know whether or not we talk a lot in independent schools about the public purpose of independent schools. And to me, I don't know whether there could ever be unity around that kind of thing, but I think the need for an investment in what's going on in the world, which ties in with a lot of what both of you are talking about here. And this isn't a question, but I would appreciate a comment as to whether or not you see a need for independent schools to come together around something that would impact who it is that comes, what they end up with when they finish our schools, what is our case for support, which to me, the case for support is built to me on our ability to impact the world. That's right. my sense of it. So anything you can say to that, I would appreciate it from either one.
I can say that that's very inspiring. And, I've watched my institution get deeply engaged in some very troubled neighborhoods that we used to ignore. It was the island of privilege, and then don't go into that neighborhood after midnight. That was the sort of dialogue. And that's really changed. And I think two things happened. Number one, this private institution, at least that I represent, is finally really in the public service, which it should be. But number two, I had hoped for this, I just didn't expect it to see it so soon. What it has done to my institution and the people who work there, especially the people who are involved in some of this stuff, has just completely lifted it up in great ways. And I'm talking about not only the quality of work, but just the sort of dialogue and the humanity and the way they've really sort of leaned into this and keep coming back and wanting to do more, and then enlisting other colleagues in this. And so if you want to give someone an ethical education, I mean, you can talk about it in the classroom, but give them an opportunity, to show that they are ethical and humane, and create a context for them, and just watch the magic. Just set it up and give them what they need to do it, and watch the magic, because it's so powerful. There's no way you can convey these types of things in classrooms or laboratories or anything else. They have to live that.
Yeah, I mean, I know, I love, and by the way, I blog frequently, and I'm going to blog a lot about what happened this evening by tomorrow or so. Successful versus significant. What a tremendous image to leave with some words. Maybe that's what I'm trying to test out of this great versus leading. We probably have a wide distribution of independent school health in this school. We probably have schools that don't have to worry about admissions next year or 10 years down the road, and others who are worrying about it tomorrow desperately. They're maybe stressed. I would suggest for those that have any degree of comfort whatsoever that it is not difficult to perform your fiduciary responsibility to maintain an independent school where it is today. And I would ask people to think about where you want to be on that curve of successful versus significant, and great versus leading, and the sort of activities you're talking about. Can we really call ourselves significant or leading if we are focused on a very, very narrow viewpoint, a definition of success? And do we want our students to walk away with that?
Thank you. Yeah. That's a great segue to lead us into our next phase of the evening. I want to thank you both, John and Grant, for sharing all of your great ideas, thoughts, insights, some great concrete examples of generative thinking with us tonight. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
President Fry needs to leave us, so I'm going to let him gracefully depart while we make a couple of more announcements here. Thank you again so much. Thank you. Veterans of this particular event know that it's the one event each year where we assign seating and purposefully mix you up with other people from other schools that you may or may not know. We want you to learn about other schools and learn from others in their roles as trustees and administrative leaders at their schools. So you'll find that information on your name tag, your table number, and there's also a color-coded button for your entree selection. As we find from experience, most people don't remember what they ordered, so that'll tip off the servers. As soon as I'm done speaking, Grant is going to step back up here and give you a couple of prompts to begin your dinner conversation, which will lead us into the next phase after dinner of our table work, group exercises, really getting down to some of what we've talked about here. Once he dismisses you, we ask that you kindly proceed back to the dining hall, which is right by where you checked in earlier this evening. Have your seats, make your introductions, and begin eating. And as soon as we're all seated, we will have a greeting from head of school here at Shipley, Steve Pilch. So Grant, I turn it back over to you. Thanks.
So in the spirit of nimbleness, I've totally changed my mind about what the provocations at dinner should be, and that's okay. So I tried to take notes of what Dr. Fry was talking about, and find the overlaps of what he was saying and what I was saying. And so here's what I would suggest for your dinner conversation. We just talked about two very contextual ideas: great versus leading, successful versus significant. Those are contextual. Those are big, broad boundary conditions. Within those, jot down one or more of the following words or phrases, and be the provocateur at your table who pushes some discussion about one or more of these words within that context, within that idea of, you all don't have, well, the heads do. Trustees, you don't have to worry about the weeds here. You should be up here at this level. Here are some words that overlap between our two unscripted we did not collaborate these. Experiential, collaborative, community, cross-disciplinary, seismic shift, and then he used a bunch of words, hybrid, online, global, partnerships, which is what I'm trying to describe when I use the term cognitosphere. This is the evolution of the cognitosphere. And then one other, how do people and program and time, how are those really informed by learning, not as standalone resources and entities? Time, space, how do those relate to learning, not as a standalone entity? All of these were themes that came out in my what ifs, at the very high what ifs, and obviously resonated with John and his work. So there's some provocation for dinner that will lead into some work after dinner. Is that, yep? Great. Go eat.
Really impressive engagement. Did you like the audience? Did you feel?
Yeah, I think they're pretty engaged. A few, you're always going to get a few who nod off, but
Disadvantage of being on the front row. Like,
Yeah.
I didn't have to feel walking behind.
yeah.
But I think so. Sometimes I look around, I really sense I'm sure they were listening to John. I think this is both of them. And, with no prep, I'm assuming neither of you really knew what the other.
No, I had no idea.
That's it came off really
Tremendous amount of this is stuff that we're all seeing out there. Like in biz, we could have gotten, any other two people from K-12 and university. Same audience.
You're compelling on your own. John would be compelling on his own.